Well, in Read the Bible in Lockdown, the temple is now built by Solomon, and we'll see what happens now that it's ready to have God dwell in it. Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 8 and hear what God has to say.
1 Kings 8. Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of the Israelite families, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, the city of David. So now that Solomon has built the temple, he's now asking for the ark. Here's the ark. Of course, it's got the 2 stone tablets from the 10 Commandments in it, but the ark, since it was built, symbolizes the presence of God. That's where God is present with his people at the ark. And now, with the temple built, the ark is going to go in there. Let's keep going. Verse 2. All the Israelites came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Elanim, in the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord and the tent of meeting and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and the Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant into its place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. So again, here's the temple, and the ark is being brought right through to the back, the most secluded, the most set-apart place. It goes in that most holy place there, far on the left. That's where the ark was to go. Verse 7, the cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. These poles were so long that the ends could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but not from outside the holy place, and they are still there today. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, that's Mount Sinai, where the Lord had made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." So here's a big climax in the story. The glory of the Lord filled Solomon's temple. So here is the place where God sees fit to dwell, to be with his people. The temple is a little bit like God's business address. You know, you might have an office in the city where people would go and meet you. Here is God's business address. It's where you went to do business with God. You know, God is everywhere. He's omnipresent, but particularly for his people to meet him and to worship him and to serve him and sacrifice to him, the temple was where you did that, and God's glory was there, symbolizing him dwelling with his people. And I'll leave you to read the rest of that section of chapter 8. But I want to go now to Solomon's prayer. Now that God was dwelling in his temple, what's Solomon going to pray to the Lord? Let's skip down to verse 22. Read the other verses after this. Verse 22, then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands towards heaven and said, "Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below, you who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way." So Solomon is declaring the praise of God, that he is so mighty, but also that he has kept his covenant of love, his promise to love his people as they follow him. Verse 24, you have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. With your mouth you have promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it, as it is today. Now, Lord, the God of Israel, keep for your servant David, my father, the promises you made to him when you said, you shall never fail to have a successor to sit before me on the throne of Israel. If only your descendants are careful in all they do to walk before me faithfully, as you have done. And now, God of Israel, let your word that you promised your servant David, my father, come true. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? Yet give your attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy, Lord my God. Hear the cry and the prayer that your servant is praying in your presence this day. May your eyes be opened towards this temple night and day, this place of which you said, my name shall be there, so that you will hear the prayer your servant prays towards this place. Hear the supplication of your servant and of all your people Israel when they pray towards this place. Hear from heaven your dwelling place. When you hear, forgive. So Solomon is calling on the promise that God has made. All the promises God has made, both for him and for his people. And now that God, can't be contained in the temple, but now that he is here in the temple and is dwelling there, Solomon is saying, answer these prayers, hear our prayers. And I'll leave you to read through the rest of the chapter, which is Solomon's prayer. But let me just let me give you one example of what he prays for and what that means for us. Verse 35, we'll skip to that. When the heavens are shut up and there is no rain because your people have sinned against you. Okay, so when the people sin, God has promised judgment in the Old Testament. We'll see more of that in the days to come. One of which is drought. Then, so they've realized they've sinned, or the drought has come, they've realized they've sinned. And verse halfway through that sentence, and when they pray towards this place, this temple, and give praise to your name and turn from their sin because you have afflicted them, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel. Teach them the right way to live and send rain on the land you gave your people for an inheritance. So what Solomon is saying basically is he's praying what God has promised. He's saying, okay, you promised that you will send judgment when we sin, but you've also promised to forgive when we turn from our sin and turn back to you and pray to this temple once again. And you've also promised to teach the people the right way to live and to bless them. And so Solomon, all through, as you read through the rest of chapter 8 and Solomon's prayer of dedication at the temple, you see that he prays what God has promised. He asks God to do as he promises. And wouldn't that be a great thing for you to pray now? Why don't you finish reading through chapter 8 of 1 Kings and then pray what God has promised. A great example of that is the Lord's Prayer. It's in Matthew 6 if you can't remember. Have a look at Matthew 6 if you want to. Pray the Lord's Prayer. They're all things that God has promised us anyway. And so in our dependence on him, we call on God to fulfill the promises he has for us. Why don't you do that now? Read over the chapter and then pray what God has promised. And don't be surprised if he answers that prayer.